everybody, and welcome to a review of Queen of the Black Coast. This is published by Glénat Éditions, written by Jean-David Morvan and Pierre Alary, based on the original story by Robert E. Howard, written in 1934. So, you're probably wondering, what the heck is this, and where's the Marvel logo on it? So, a little context. As some of you may know, Marvel Comics currently holds the publishing rights to Conan the Barbarian, the character created by Robert E. Howard, and has done so since last year in 2019. Not last year. Since 2019. What am I talking about? Previous to that, for 15 years, since 2003, if I'm not mistaken. Right, since 2003, Dark Horse Comics held the rights. And previous to that, it was again Marvel, only this time it was a run that lasted from the 1970s all the way to, I think, 1995, something like that. I'm reasonably sure of that. Suffice to say, they had the rights for a really long time, and during that time, they created two specific comic series that pretty much defined the sword and sorcery genre in comics from then on. They served the benchmark, basically. The first was Conan the Barbarian. This is the regular comic book version. This is, full color, serialized, your standard comic kind of situation. The other was the legendary Savage Sword of Conan. This one was published in magazine format and completely in black and white, and contrary to the regular comic, did not have the Comics Code approved little sigil in the corner there, which means they could get away with a whole bunch of stuff that you could not get away with in regular comics at that time. We're talking nudity, violence, bloodshed, the works. Now, that's for the United States and Canada and most of the English-speaking world. In France, however, Robert E. Howard's characters are in the public domain, which means if you just don't use the same iconography and don't use the same typeset or the same name, you can publish your own Conan comics, which is what Glénat did, under the title of Conan Le Cimmérien, Conan the Cimmerian, which, that's where it's from. They can't use Conan the Barbarian as their title, but that doesn't mean they can't make some pretty damn good adaptations of Conan's stories, which is what we are going to be looking at today. So these ones have been blood of my enemies. So these ones haven't been published in the order they were originally published, of course, since Queen of the Black Coast is, I think, the fourth story that Robert E. Howard wrote about the character that was published back in Weird Tales in the day. But it is the first one that was released here. As I said, the adaptation and script by Jean-David Morvan, who's worked on such comics as Spirou and Fantasio and stuff like that, which is, a staple of French BD. And art by Pierre Alary, who is mostly known, in my case, by a comic called Belladone. It's an interesting little one. I recommend taking a look at it. So, speaking of the art, that's basically, we're going to be going over that. My goal here is to go over each and every one of these albums as they come out. There are currently 11 of them released at the moment. I have 10 of them, and the last one, the 11th one, that just came out in January for God in the Bowl, which I still haven't received yet, is to go over these things, check out the art, the adaptation itself, quality, how faithful it is to the original stories, and check out a bit how it compares to previous adaptations. See how that works out. So, starting off with the art, Pierre Alary's work is, to put it bluntly, pretty cartoony. If you're looking for more photorealistic artwork, you're not going to get it with this album. Now, the artwork itself looks good. It's colorful. It's got a decent amount of detail as well, and good, excellent line work. You can see a lot of very cool, also, uses of splash images. Like, for instance, this montage of Conan after he boards the Messentia out of Argos. You can see a bit of himself getting to the swing of things, so to speak, as he's dealing with the local pirates and stuff like that. There's also some actually very inventive, I find, use of borders in the comic. For instance, this first battle between Conan and Belit's Black Corsairs, you have the entire horde of them surrounding the entire page here. Starting out from the previous page, and you have Conan actually fighting them in the center, you get the impression of this massive number of enemy soldiers without technically having to show them all at the same time, which might get a bit hard to spot for the actual characters. So that's, also interesting like that. You also get pretty cool pages like this, where you have Conan defeating a gigantic serpent that's, just snapped up a bunch of his men. Incidentally, this snake is way bigger here than it was in the actual story. That's one thing we'll get into the adaptation. But I do like this whole moment, like this frozen moment of Conan bisecting the serpent, and it's just here on white, just frozen on the page like that. And then immediately going on to them entering a lost city that they're exploring. And you also get the kind of scale just from here. You have their ship coming in, and here you don't see the city at first. You see its reflection in the water as it goes over the ruins of like a plaza and some stairs. That's actually a very inventive way of introducing that. It's a little bit of a shame though that at the very first thing that they show off, the city of Argos, where Conan starts his adventures, you have this great image of the city, setting the tone, setting the place and the architecture, and you have these close-ups of the judge, or rather the head of the judge that Conan has just beheaded for being a complete dickhead to him. And then when it skips to the next page, when we get the actual situation, it's small. And the judge's head is right here at the bottom of the frame. Personally, I would have gone for something like at least half the page. You're introducing Conan the Barbarian for the first time in the story. It needs to be a bit more pop, if that makes any sense. It's a bit of a nitpick, really, but, it's something that comes to mind when I think about that. You also have, other interesting uses of that. For instance, when Conan is facing off against, for the first time, really, against the main adversary of the story, this winged, demonic, bastardized, degenerate last survivor of that ancient city who's been reduced to this horrifying monster. It and its wings form the entire border of the page, with Conan in the center, gradually being affected by the surrounding black lotus blossoms, which are knocking him out. And that's it does give the sense of this thing's power. It's like it surrounds him. It is in control here. They go into flashback from the Black Lotus's influence about what exactly happened here. You also have this particular moment when Conan returns to the wrecked ship and finds Billy, the love of his life, being strung up from the mast by this creature while he was unconscious. And you have this moment. You have the full frame here, but you also have these smaller insert images that really focus on the individual thing. Like he walks into the place, he sees one of his men dead. And then you see close up, and it's his severed head there on the ground. And then Conan's face here, looking up in horror at her, and then we see her finally from his perspective. So there is an excellent use of placement in the image, with all the information that you're supposed to gather from that in a way that really does bring out the emotion of the whole thing. So while I understand that a lot of people probably wouldn't enjoy the actual art style, because, let's face it, it's not too common in mainstream comics, especially if you're more of a DC or Marvel person. But for a guy like me who's grown up on bande dessinée, I'm from Quebec. It was pretty much a given I was going to. This art style isn't really that uncommon in terms of that. And in terms of the art, you're not missing out on anything, because we are talking decapitations. We are talking bloodshed. We are talking full-on full-page sex scene. Now, you don't see any actual nipple or anything, but you do get a pretty good idea of what these two's relationship was like in the bedroom. And, of course, there's a giant snake right after that, so, innuendo much. Now, that's it for the artwork. So, I give it, it's definitely got a passable grade. It's not going to be everybody's tastes, but ultimately, I like it. Now, in terms of the adaptation itself, there are a couple of changes from the original 1934 story, as, there were bound to be. First thing I noticed, and this is something that doesn't necessarily bother me, but it is an odd choice, I find, is that they changed the kind of narration to the story from a third-person omniscient narrator to Conan doing a first-person subjective narrator. So instead of, he did something, it's I did something. This isn't the first time this has been done for a Conan comic, because the King Conan series by Dark Horse that related all the events of actually Conan when he's king of Aquilonia do use that format, except in that case they had a wraparound story of him relating these stories to a chronicler who would eventually become the guy who writes the Nemedian Chronicles. So there is that. I find that when you're doing like this kind of first person, narrated, especially when it's done in this style, having a wraparound story I find works a little bit better. It's not essential, but it's just one of those things. Now, there are a couple of other smaller changes. So, for instance, when Belit is first describing her plan to visit this lost city up in the Stygian jungles down a poisoned river, she mentions the sailor that was found wrapped in black lotus and completely out of his mind, who died soon after. This is basically one of the only people that's ever come back from that river. Here in this case, he describes a strange kind of prophecy, almost. The love that you have for the man of the north will be stronger than death, which is a foreshadowing for what happens later on in the story, because if you've ever watched Conan the Barbarian, when Valeria comes back from the dead and, helps save Conan in extremis, this is the story where that particular plot point comes from. It's just applied to a different character in that case. But here it kind of I don't know why they did that. It doesn't really actually serve any kind of purpose when you think about it. It's there, it foreshadows the ending, but Belit's own words, as they're discussing things just before that giant snake shows up, already foreshadow that particular ending. She says that I love you so much that I would come back from hell to be at your side if you were in danger. So it's really a bit superfluous when you think about it. So, beyond that, there is particular plot points here that are very much departures from that. You have, when they find this massive treasure, which is a lot bigger in the comic. Here's another thing that's, substantially larger than in the story. One of the main treasures that Belit finds is a ruby necklace. Like this priceless looking, ruby necklace, like congealed blood droplets. And that is what she's hanging from on the mast of the ship once the winged creature kills her. Here, you can kind of see it actually right here in the image, but it never reappears once she's actually on the mast. It's just not there. It's an odd thing to remove from it, I think. Beyond that, there's also one other thing that is typically removed from a lot of these adaptations, I find. But one of the things that this creature has at its disposal is the power to use the ancient magics of its people. Because these were very advanced civilization. It's just they were brought low after a natural disaster, poisoned the river, and destroyed, some of their, whatever filtration system they were using to keep the water drinkable, and resulted in them decaying and mutating over time until finally this last one is the last final twisted, horrific, monster version of these once nearly angelic people who stood tall above humanity, and now there's this horror instead, who is using their power that they once had for completely nefarious reasons. In this case, it would actually, during the flashback, it actually shows how it took a group of Stygians who had found their way to the Lost City and transformed them into were-hyenas, like these great, huge, frightfully intelligent hyenas that it uses as, minions. Which is pretty cool because before it then attacks Conan during the final battle, it sends them after him. He kills them, being wounded in the process, which weakens him facing the great monster himself. And by the time that thing is dead, all the hyenas have reverted back to human corpses and then fall to dust from age. And that's just like this extra little, point of creep factor to it. This thing wasn't just some horrible monster. This thing was smart. This thing was a creature of, intelligence, madness, and evil, but nevertheless, almost pitiable in its loneliness and horror. So it's one of those points that's, missing from this adaptation. So beyond that, everything else is pretty much nitpicks that I could have. So really, this isn't necessarily my favorite adaptation of Queen of the Black Coast, but I think that mostly comes down to the fact that it's almost an unfair comparison because the previous versions of this story that were brought to comics were extended and elongated due to the fact that it wasn't just one album being covered. The original Conan the Barbarian adaptation of this took place in issues 57, 58, and then issue 100. In between that, you had them, Marvel and Roy Thomas, covering the entire 2-year period where Conan and Belit and their men actually went on their adventures, sacking Stygian cities, laying waste to merchant ships, and generally getting into all sorts of pirate hijinks. You actually got to get to know the crew, the different members of it, so that when they die, it's a gut punch, especially, when Belit dies, because you've gotten to know their relationship. The same applies to the Dark Horse version of the story as well, although in fewer issues. Oh, that is actually something I forgot. There's also a fight, not just with those hyenas. Before that, Conan has to face off against one of his own men, his second in command, who's gone completely insane and is now attacking him. And that, while you don't necessarily have too much of an emotional attachment to the character in the original story either, simply due to the fact that you don't have as much time with him, here it's completely absent. And that is something you miss. You get that sense that something horrible has happened, not just because everybody's dead, but because there's, again, this last survivor of the massacre who's out of his mind, just like the person that was encountered by Belit, who was, wrapped in lotus back of them. So, does this thing make the other adaptation superfluous? No. In fact, in many ways they are superior adaptations. However, this one does stand on its own as a damn good book, and I would highly recommend picking it up, especially if you're a completionist like me. Especially if it's one of these first edition ones, because, as is the case with all of these we'll find, they come with an extra 16 pages to them, which cover also the history of the story, all its, historical and context, its publication history and all that. A little bit of background also on, Belit herself, and some nice behind-the-scenes making-of stuff, which I always find interesting for these kinds of things. It also comes with a number of extra splash pages and pin-ups from a variety of artists, done in different styles. So if this is more the kind of art style you enjoy, you're going to get a little bit of it from your money. So, Queen of the Black Coast. For those of you who can speak French, I highly recommend picking up one of these. You can get them on, the French Amazon, order straight from Glénat, or if you have, if you're in Quebec or something like that, Grenoble, Archambault, those ones. For those of you who only speak English, Ablaze Comics is doing the translations for these. They haven't done all of the ones that Glénat's published yet, but they're working their way through them. Those ones are separated to 4 different comic books as opposed to a single hardback. So you're going to be, getting them piecemeal at that point. However, they have done for Queen of the Black Coast. So if you would speak English, that's your best bet. If, however, you are a bit of a Francophile, I highly recommend picking up one of these babies. So that's it for this one. Next one is going to be one I particularly like. That's going to be for Black Colossus. And let me tell you, if you had a problem with the art style in this one, you are not going to have any problems with this one. So until then, I've been Zero Sum, and I'd like to thank you for watching. Until next time, bye-bye.